After finding the sources that you plan to use in your papers and projects, there is still work to do to determine whether or not your sources are appropriate to your topic and assignment. This video will present a set of criteria that you can use to evaluate sources of information. While this tutorial will provide an overview of the general criteria you should use when evaluating your sources, it is always a good idea to review your assignment guidelines and talk with your instructor to make sure the types of sources you found are appropriate for your assignment. When collecting sources for your papers and projects, you need to evaluate them to make sure they meet the requirements for your assignment or discipline. The criteria listed here should be considered for all of the sources you hope to use. The following slides include questions you should ask yourself when evaluating your sources. The first thing you should do when evaluating a source of information is to identify the purpose. All information sources have a purpose. Another way to think about purpose is to ask yourself, why was this source written in the first place? In the case of scholarly journal articles, the purpose is usually stated somewhere in the introduction. Let's take a look at an example. This is a scholarly journal article about the importance of active learning and information literacy instruction. In this example, the purpose is clearly stated in the last paragraph of the introduction. At this point, you would ask yourself, does the purpose of this source match my topic or the purpose of my assignment? If the answer is yes, you should proceed with reading the rest of the article. If the answer is no, you may want to look for additional sources. While it is true that scholarly journal articles often have a clearly stated purpose, popular sources, such as magazines and newspapers, do not. In the case of popular sources, you should read the article and summarize the purpose in a few sentences. Doing this will help you evaluate whether or not the purpose of the source is appropriate to your topic. You should always be able to identify the author of an information source. Even if no author is listed, you should be able to identify the host organization or entity responsible for creating the content. Another way to think about authority is to think about having expertise in the subject matter. People who are considered scholars or experts in a certain subject area want to be known for the scholarship that they produce. For this reason, the author of scholarly sources should not be hard to identify. Let's look again at our example. Not only do we know who the authors are, we also know the universities where they conducted their research. If we wanted to, we could look up more about these authors to further determine that they have the authority to write about this topic. Part of evaluating your sources is determining if the information is reliable and accurate. You should examine your source for evidence that the information provided was carefully researched. In the case of scholarly journal articles, there should be a bibliography or works cited page at the end of the article. You should also check that any data, statistics, or facts are documented. Lastly, look at the publisher or information source. Scholarly sources are published by academic institutions, research associations, and other types of professional organizations. There are a variety of ways that you can find out information related to the publisher. When in doubt, ask a librarian or your instructor whether or not the publisher is a reputable source. When evaluating your sources, you should also look at the publication date to determine whether or not the information is timely to your topic. Timeliness should be considered when your topic covers subject matter where the most recent information is important. For example, you would not want to use out-of-date information when writing about a topic related to technology, since advancement in technology changes frequently. On the other hand, if you are writing about a historical topic, the publication date might not matter because the topic may not change over time. You should try to determine the point of view of the author and whether or not the source is biased in any way. Some questions you can ask yourself are, is this source trying to persuade me to do something or to change my point of view? And, is this source trying to prove a point? It is okay to use a source that does not cover all perspectives of an issue, but you should be able to recognize that a bias exists. After evaluating your source on the criteria presented in this tutorial, the final step is to determine whether or not the source meets your information need. Is this source appropriate to your topic and your assignment? In other words, does the purpose of this source match the purpose of your assignment? You should also ask yourself, how will I use this source in my assignment? If these questions are hard to answer, it may be because your sources do not meet your information need. The criteria for evaluation presented in this tutorial should be considered for each piece of information that you plan to use in your assignment. If you take the time to evaluate your sources to decide whether or not they are appropriate to both your topic and your assignment, your final product will be better and the writing process will be easier. Thank you for viewing this tutorial. From here, go to the library's homepage or to the nearest library and get started with your research.